Hi, and welcome to this week's edition of the Taming the Polar Bears broadcasts. This week's topic is thoughts and data input and introduction. Now we've been learning a little bit more about thoughts when we started last week in our introduction to cognitive behavior therapy, mindfulness, meditation, CBT. We saw that working on our thoughts was a key cornerstone to learning to turn around our mental states and control what's going on in our minds and worlds and inner worlds and outer worlds. So today, we're not going to talk so much about thoughts per se, but data input, what I call data input, is a really important aspect of understanding where our thoughts come from and why they're there. We can work on our thoughts, and we start to learn to do that in cognitive behavior therapy. We talked about thoughts a bit in the broadcast on our negative inner dialogue. And we're still kind of chipping away at the surface there. Today, we're going to start looking in this broadcast. We'll get a little bit of an introduction about the deeper parts of the brain, we'll say, where thoughts come from. And not just the thoughts themselves, but the nature of the thoughts. Okay, so move this in a little bit. Now, a lot of what we talk about here in the broadcasts and the webinars is based on what I've written in the blog. So we're going to have, when we're have a look, in understanding this business of data input, we're going to look at some of the concepts I've been introducing and talking about a bit in the blog. And those are things like consciousness. You're going to talk quite a bit about consciousness, conscious awareness, what we're aware of, our conscious experience. And in understanding that, we need to know more. You see, I misspelled that. Need to know more about this business called the subconscious. Just briefly, this is old Freudian stuff, but Freud was well over 100 years ago. Things have advanced a little bit since then. And he was on the right track with his ideas of subconscious, what's at the surface, and subconscious, what's below that. Neuroscience looks at this quite differently. And that's how I look at it, through the lens of neuroscience. So consciousness is kind of what we're aware of, what's in our mind. Subconscious is, a lot of what I've been talking about in the brain. These vast regions and systems, all these things. Until I started talking about them, you had no idea they were there. And it's these, like who's ever heard of the amygdala before? So when I'm talking about the subconscious, I'm talking about all these deep brain regions that create what we experience as what I like to call our conscious experience, okay? So, consciousness is kind of what we're aware of, what's kind of, like I like to call it, that moving picture show that flashes awake when we wake up in the morning. The subconscious is all this vast neuronal machinery and mechanisms that are going on way below our awareness, that's creating what we experience in our day-to-day waking lives, okay? So we touch on this a little bit today. Another important concept that I've written about. We have to get to more, but we're going to start touching on today is our realities. I've introduced this in Neuroscience 101, how we all have different realities. Every one of us perceives the world and everything around us a little bit differently, sometimes a lot differently, as you've noticed. Okay, so realities we're going to touch on a little bit today, and how we perceive reality is a great deal of what creates our consciousness, this picture show that we have going on in our heads all the time. That's kind of our perception of reality. And then speaking of reality, sort of a related concept, our perceptions. And further related is our worldviews. Some of these I haven't really explicitly talked about yet. This I've certainly talked about quite a bit. If you're a regular follower of the blog, you'll be at least a little bit familiar with this. Most people, again, most regular followers of the blog will know I talk about realities a little bit. And this is going to kind of, when I talk about data input, this is going to be one of the key things that creates our reality. Perception and worldviews I haven't talked about quite so much, but they're quite related. But what this all ties into here for our purposes is our mental health. Oops, our mental health. Okay, so now what is this whole business about data input? I'm going to take away this for now. Now, I've also talked quite a bit so far in some of the previous broadcasts and in the blog as well, about what our brains do. We never think much about what our brains do, and that's why we're here, to learn about all these things. And I've talked about our senses, our sense of hearing, sense of sight, sense of smell, sense of taste, our tactile senses. And all this is incoming information that the brain has to process. This stuff comes in 24/7. And, part of why I talk about the difference between conscious and subconscious, this can be kind of mind-blowing to many people. But, we're only really aware of a tiny fraction of what our brains are actually observing, seeing, and dealing with in your head, in your brain. The vast majority of that, the vast majority of what our eyes are taking in, all this visual information that our eyes are taking in, and the auditory information that our ear and inner processes are taking in, the vast majority of that is processed subconsciously, way below your conscious awareness. Really important to understand when I start talking about data input and why that's important to be more consciously aware of. And we're going to learn some different ways to be more aware of what we're taking in and what to take in and what not to take in and why. Okay, so again, the vast majority of what your brain is absorbing and dealing with at any one moment in your life is below your conscious awareness. Now, just as a kind of tiny example, If you're watching this and paying attention, hopefully, and listening to my words and kind of concentrating on them, that's where our awareness is. But in fact, there's all kinds of sounds going on around you that your brain is kind of blocked out. They're there, but they're kind of filtered out a little bit, so that my voice can get, and this, what you're sort of paying attention to here, can get get sort of a higher priority and get put on to what you're consciously dealing with. Okay, so this is going on all the time. And there's some interesting ways we're going to look at that when we begin to understand some of our other little brain brain bugs is the term I use, and what's possibly going on with some other aspects of our mental health, not today. Okay, so the vast majority of sensory information around us is being dealt with subconsciously. Okay, now what we're going to learn about here is, the things that, there's so many different things we can talk about, this data I'm talking about. So today we're just going to try to focus on some of the things that, not only I feel, I only feel this way because of all the research and study I've done, but what is fairly well understood by, in the fields of cognitive neuroscience, cognitive psychology, a number of different academic fields, and even philosophy, and just a lot of people in general will understand this. So what we want to look at when we are learning to understand what this business of data input is and how it's affecting our realities and our mental states are things, most of our, to put this a little differently, the data we're talking about is going to be, we'll just say things going on in the world. Another thing, just briefly before I go on, I've talked in a couple of posts about empathy. And how many of us who have, difficult mental states and moods and mood control and things, I've kind of been working towards a kind of a theory and concept that many of us are what we term highly empathetic people. So again, talking about, this data, this information around us that we're absorbing all the time. We all do that. Every human, every creature does that. And we all just filter it a little differently. But what's kind of becoming quite well known is that many of us are the term is highly empathetic people, and it's it's an okay term. I don't think it gives us a real accurate picture of what's going on and why. But for now, we'll use that term. And I've written a couple of posts on empathy, and how some of us just see to sort of observe and get impacted more by what's going on in the world around us. And indeed, a lot of my research into all kinds of case studies and case histories, and I looked into this going back centuries. There's all kinds of interesting studies on suicides, reasons for suicides, reasons for meltdowns and things. And a theme that just emerged over and over again was this pain of the world around us and not being able to bear that. So in the two posts on, when I introduced the concept of empathy, and then another post, taming empathy, I started at the very end, started introducing this idea that we have to be more careful of the news and all these things we're taking in. And that's what I mean about the data input we're talking about, going to start talking about. And today is just a introduction to that. So, and I've also spoken quite a bit about, how, the modern world, and I spoke about this in the post on taming empathy. The human brain just didn't evolve to take in this much information about so much. Mental health problems are on the rise everywhere. And again, just a lot of my research, a lot of what I understood about the brain and what it's designed to do and what it's not particularly well designed to do, just came back to this over and over again for me about, how our brains have just not evolved and really designed to deal with so much information coming from so many sources about so many different things. So, a lot of what I talk about with changing our data input has much to do with that. Our brains just simply aren't designed to absorb so much information. And for us highly empathetic people, deep, caring, quite passionate, emotionally motivated people, this is especially difficult. Okay, so data input, this information that our brains are absorbing, much of it below our conscious awareness. We get much of this. There's various kinds of media, and I'm not going to get into a long thing about media studies. There's on the left and the right, and so much of it is political. I'm going to touch on that a little bit, but various media. Most of us grew up in the age of print media, newspapers and magazines and so on. We still do that a little bit. And then the TV came along. That became quite a major source. And, these things, started bringing in news from around the world. We take that for granted. But news did not, the news we used to absorb, until probably World War II, and again, I'm not going to get into a whole history of media and things, but news that we used to focus on tended to be more local. And as print and TV media became more widespread and things began to go around the world, we began to get more and more news about goings on around the world. This is a good thing and bad thing. It's important to be aware of what's going on in the world, for sure. I mean, we're all globally connected today. But again, we're just absorbing way too much. Now, as we move past these things, we have the whole online world. Again, this connects us to the world in ways we were unimaginable just 20 years ago. Back to media. So a lot of us tend to get a lot of our data input from social media. Okay, so these are some of the sources. And traditionally, before these things existed, and still today, we have social sources, and by that I mean, family. This is more how our brains are designed to work, which isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. That's just you know, in our evolutionary development, this was the predominant way for literally tens of thousands of years until the last 20 or 30, 40 years or so. Social, family, friends, neighbors, things like that, co-workers, and so on. And you know, all these sources are going to be bringing in additional information, telling us additional information, and one way or another, whether we try to block this out or not, we absorb it. And, you know, again, I'm not, you know, kind of want to get away from judging it good or bad, or it just, we're just going to start looking at these things, and this is just the way it is. You know, these are just things we're going to learn. And, you know, one of the things I'm trying to get many of you away from is having value judgments and emotional judgments on all these things. Okay, so you know, we don't. What I'm getting at is we don't want to put blame on all these things. They're just there. They just are what they are. Okay, and like what we're learning in cognitive behavior therapy, we're going to start learning to take more responsibility for what our brains are absorbing and how we attach value to those things, and how we deal with it. And all this ties back to what's creating our thoughts and what those thoughts are doing to us or can do to us. Okay, so we have all these various forms of media. Now, you know, the thing with all these sources, they're all going to have some sort of slant. They're all going to have some kind of bias. And again, I'm, you know, I really try to avoid politics in here. I'm not going to get into left and right politics and all these, because the truth is, you know, when we look at all these media sources, and even down to our individual friends and family and ourselves, everybody's going to have some kind of slant to how they view things, some kind of bias. Another thing we can think about here was my post on brain bugs and cognitive distortions. And in there I outlined, you know, and this is all really, really well understood cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology, you know, how we all have different biases. We all filter things a little differently, and we attach value quite arbitrarily according to our own personal beliefs and worldviews. So everybody does this, from individuals to any kind of media. There's no conspiracy behind all of this. I'm sure there are some here and there. That's another part of human nature as well. But the truth is all people tend to do this. And media outlets and social media and all these things just happen to be these same elementary, individualized ways our brains work. You know, tending to put slants and biases on things. And, you know, what we think of as the mass media and these larger media sources just are group ways of doing the same thing. Okay, so now the next step I kind of want you to start to think about. You know, there's this whole business of reality, and there's a post I wrote on belief, and these tie in here quite a bit, our beliefs, and you know, our kind of a reality. This is you know, quite difficult and philosophical examination, and in science and all these things, and we're not going to worry about that too much. You know, one of the reasons I study all this stuff is so I can kind of, because I have, you know, it's just what I do. It's what I dedicate myself to, and you know, my job is to kind of digest this down and get it into, you know, a form where we can all learn about it more, and you know, why it's important for us to understand these things a little better. So, you know, our beliefs affect our reality. Let me do it this way. You know, our beliefs affect our reality, and and our reality affects our beliefs. And you know, this is very common. You know, people have been like this since forever. We've always been this way, and this people, and this is what I talk about a little bit in the post. Well, I touch on this in both the post on reality and the post on beliefs. This is why we have science. Now, science ostensibly is supposed to help us sort through all this and create sort of an understanding in a, you know, way outside of our personal individual biases and beliefs and the way we see things and understand things, an objective reality. And then there's another term, not so common, but is used in fields like cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology, is kind of a consensus. Oh, brother, I screwed this up. I'm not going to spell that right now. Consensus reality, which is quite similar to an objective reality. And people get very suspicious about these things, about anybody telling them, you know, what's the objective truth and what's the objective reality. But science does kind of keep us that way. That's what science, that is the very, very elementary fundamental tenet of science, is to try and get outside these human brain bug ways of slanting and biasing information. Now, this is really, really difficult. This is my world. I spend a lot of time around people who are, you know, trained scientists. They're supposed to understand this, and even trained scientists have a very difficult time remaining objective and adhering to some basic principles of consensus reality. Sort of a you know, consensus reality is a broader understanding of, well, reality is something I'm going to have to get into another day, but this kind of a broader understanding of the world. Okay, so what is this? This sounds suspiciously like it doesn't have anything to do with mental health, but it does. See, what happens is, excuse me, and again, this is all stuff I've studied in great detail from a number of different angles. This whole business of reality and how we perceive the world and what's going on in the world and what that means. There's actually kind of a whole scale to this. I'm just going to draw kind of a, this is kind of crude for now, but the kind of the normal kind of consensus, and a lot of people hate the word normal, but there is a sense of normal that is important. You know, most people will kind of be down here, sorry, in the middle. Below, let me change up the colors. Below here we have basically negative, pessimistic, generally negative, pessimistic views. Down here we have the more negative emotional values, emotional outlooks, sadness, despair, hopelessness tend to be down towards this end of the scale of reality. And again, I'm not like, it's really important to understand that none of these are either inherently good, none of them are inherently bad. In truth, we need kind of a balance of all of these things. But what I'm trying to establish here and get you to understand is that there's many, many different aspects and perspectives of this general thing we think of as reality. Okay, so then up at the top, we have more positive, optimistic, positivism and optimism. And again, today's just an introduction. This is yet another series as part of Taming the Polar Bears, and I'll get into all this in more detail in further episodes as I plot out all these little mini courses. So this is again, this is all really quite well understood and has been. Philosophers have been observing this for thousands of years, and so these are things philosophy has always studied and observed and tried to understand. And the recent advances in neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience is giving us a better understanding. So I'm attempting to digest a lot of stuff down into a kind of a relatively straightforward, simple chart. So, most people, I'm going to call most people, these so-called normal, regular people out there, most people are going to be sort of in the middle. They're not too up, they're not too down, and this is, when I look at happy people and why they're happy and untroubled and things, this is where they'll be, and there's reasons for this. I have an whole other thing to talk about ego defenses and kind of what puts us this way or that way, and that's a different topic again. But this, again, this is all produced by subconscious brain regions and how our individual brains are structured and wired and so on. And we don't consciously choose to be these things exactly. We can sort of make choices, and what we're learning here is how to do that. But most of this is very subconscious. So most people will kind of be in here. They'll be, a little up, little down, little this way, little that way. But basically, they'll kind of stay in the middle. They might have the odd time where they plunge down into depression, or sometimes where they're kind of wildly over optimistic and positive. But basically, there's all kinds of brain mechanisms and brain networks that tend to, and again, this is sort of the ideal kind of optimum, and this is where we're sort of shooting for, folks. The brain tends to keep us from being too much this way or that way, okay? Now, more people that we can sort of, this is a lot of us. I'm bipolar. I'll get to that in a minute. But people who with tend to more towards depression, get beat down by the world, suffer from anxiety and things like that, tend to be more down here. And again, this isn't inherently wrong or bad. It's just the way these brains work for better or worse. I talk a lot about, there's two factors, and I get into this in the post on genetic and environmental factors in individual brain development. Brains will kind of be genetically predisposed a certain way, and then the environment will tend to reinforce that. These are things these are all things we're learning to understand and work on. Okay, so so this is where depression and negative, pessimistic worldviews, anxious worldviews, worries about the future and what's going to happen in the world this is more the reality, just this more negative aspect of what's going on in the world. Then we have really positive, optimistic people, sunny dispositions, all that stuff. People down here just hate these sons of a bitches, these goddamn sunny disposition people. But again, this is not inherently right or wrong. This is just the way these people are, just as this the way these people are. And then there's these people that just tend to be up here more, and again, everybody has ups and downs. Nobody's a flat line. Like even the most positive person will be down here sometimes. Sometimes these people will be up here. There's no real hard way of going through life like this. Some people certainly tend to end up this way more. And these are some of the really difficult cases I've read about and studied in case histories and people that I've met in psychiatric hospitals. Other people, I think of Richard Branson. He's just always pessimistic, positive and optimistic. I just created a new word, pessimistic, positive and optimistic, and that's just his view of the world. That's the way his brain is designed, and most of his life has kind of reinforced that. Again, these are just really simple examples. It's not meant to be a hard, clear-cut way to understand yourself or every person you meet or know. Then there's people like me. What color do I have left? I'm bipolar. I'm all over the place. I could be way up here. I could be way down here, a little bit in here, up here, down here. I'm all over the place. So one of the interesting things about being bipolar and having a bipolar brain is I get I experience every bit of reality there is. I've seen it all. So it's useful because I'm not this way all the time. I've certainly spent and certainly the past number of years, I spent some horrific amount of time down here. I might have gone off the scale down here somewhere. But my brain will sort of be able to see this side too, even if it's difficult. So this, what I want to sort of give you an idea of here, and what we're going to start learning about reality and how our brains absorb information around us and kind of, reinforce or slant towards how our brains are inclined to view the world. It's important to understand that there are many, many, many aspects and ways of viewing the world and perceiving the world. And a great deal of what this whole Taming the Polar Bears program is all about is getting you from, kind of a negative, pessimistic, depressive, hopeless sort of way to getting you to see that there's other ways to see and experience the world. And that doesn't happen by flipping a switch. I know many of you will be really, really tired of hearing this. This is why, a lot of people just start to have difficulty with people because you get tired of hearing this. But in this program and course, as I think of it, if you're in these difficult mental states, and you're in, and I hear this from a lot of people. I talk to a lot of people, and this is what I hear: people in enormous amounts of despair, distress, misery, darkness, these hideous, dark episodes of depression. We don't want to stay there. And, a lot of what reasons I study all this, and I work so hard to understand the brain and why it does what it does, and why so many people are lost to suicide. People who are not lost to suicide will lose their lives to drinking problems, drug problems. And these people are not getting helped because the professions in charge of supposedly understanding what's wrong and helping them been too locked into simplistic pharmacological models for understanding and dealing with all this. So I wanted to create a program, and this is what the Positive Difference Making Fundamentals are all about. How does this thing work? Why is it producing these mental states? And how to change them. And one of the greatest fundamentals I discovered was what we are absorbing, what we're allowing ourselves to absorb. And that, people, is why we are going to start working on changing our data input. And there's as I go on, we're not going to get to trying really hard to keep all of these shorter. Today's just an introduction. There's all kinds of, I study the neuroscience of this down to the molecule. Fascinating stuff. I don't expect you to do that. But when we come back to thoughts and why our thoughts have such power, and why our mental states take us where they go, and what so much of that creates that is the information our brain is taking in and how it's processing that. Now, the how it's processing that, this is, as I think you're maybe beginning to appreciate, all handled by these subconscious brain regions I've sort of been introducing you to, like when we looked at the stress response system, and even in music therapy, and well, just about every talk I've touched on little bits about different parts of our brain and how they take in and process this information and create what we experience as our personal reality. And that, all that kind of sensory information is just kind of what I mean by data. Now, the processing of that, as I've said, this is all deep subconscious brain regions, and these things don't just change how they deal with things at the flick of a switch. That's the longer term goal. We can get there. We can do quite a bit to change that, but we have to, in the beginning, just kind of do a kind of a ruthless purge of what we're absorbing on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to wrap this up. The webinar is on Sunday. We're going to talk more about, we're going to talk about this in more detail on Wednesday, on Sunday. in the webinar. But what I want you to kind of bear in mind and take away from this for now is that we really want to start paying more attention to what we're absorbing. Is it necessary to absorb that? Is it necessary to be taking in all this information? And where we're going to start ruthlessly cutting out what we're absorbing and what to replace it with. That's where I tie in music therapy. I have a number of different ways to do that. And just to come back to my own story, I really cannot emphasize how bad my mental states were in a 5 or 6, 7 year period, and how important this was for turning those around. Okay, so that's data input and thoughts. That's a little brief introduction. Again, this is, I've got a sort of an ongoing series on this. This is the introduction. We'll have a webinar on Sunday, and then I'll explain more of this in future broadcasts where we can learn more and more to understand this, what it does, why it does this, and how to change this to create a better world, better inner mental world. It sounds corny, all this business about inner peace, but that's, it sounds like some kind of new age hippie thing. But in truth, that's what everybody kind of wants. And, it's not going to completely change your entire personality and worldview, but it's going to get us, when we look at this kind of scale of, how people, all people experience reality, get you from, this sort of deep, dark place down here and get you into something a little more in the middle and optimal for your own mental health. Okay, so I'm going to sign off for now. We'll see you Sunday. Thanks for tuning in. Bye now.